We all have that one special game in our hearts. Something that transcends from being a product of entertainment to an everlasting memory, or an important piece of one's childhood. As for me, I had several. Need for Speed, Halo, Midnight Club, Doom 3, and while I lived around a time where I could go outside on the BMX or on a scooter with other kids, I still spent a lot of time on the PS2 and the Xbox. 2005 was a very mixed year for me though. I had problems at school, being social and not really fitting in with anybody. But what kept me happy was when I got to play more of my favourite games at home. That, and the support of my family and a few of my closest friends being around the corner. Those things had definitely helped me in those complicated years growing up. But one game in particular out of the Need for Speed franchise would launch with the Xbox 360, a game that is now retrospectively considered the greatest Need for Speed game in the series. And a game that is also very important to me, and that game is Need for Speed Most Wanted. EA and Black Box had joined the new generation of the console lineups, from the Nintendo Wii, the PS3 and the Xbox 360, as well as the next generation of portable consoles like the Nintendo DS and the PSP, the latter being one of my favourite consoles ever. Most Wanted was to be the first game in the 7th generation lineup, marking the next step forward in the whole franchise and walking away from the Underground series for good. What we got here was an entirely different beast, going from the neon bright lights of the Underground games to the rundown and grimy districts of Rockport City in the daytime. Most Wanted provided the same street racing experience with tuned up cars and with a variety of races, but this time the police would finally make an appearance for the first time since Hot Pursuit 2, making the races both intense and exciting at the same time. The game was a monumental success across the board, becoming one of the highest selling games in the series and one of the best selling games on the Xbox 360. The game did so well, in fact, that it even spawned off counterparts being released on the DS and the PSP. Compared to the main title though, they were a huge disappointment and didn't live up to the main game's standards whatsoever. Over the years, and as of late, Need for Speed Most Wanted has reached a cult status amongst the racing community, treating it like the bread Jesus Christ ate during the Last Supper. As a result, the game has certainly gained a lot of new fans, some being more radical, and others simply just enjoying this masterpiece of a racing game. It's one of my favourite games of all time. It does so much right, and has evolved the formula to such a degree that every other game after it hasn't felt as good in terms of how it plays. Of course though, it did have a rocky start. A demo for the game was released prior to the final product, and upon revisiting it, it was a much rougher version of the game. The cars felt a lot slower, the cops themselves were like tanks, and if they boxed you in, you were fucked. You had 3 events and 4 cars to play with, 2 BMWs and RX-8s, to give you a taste of how the game would play. In the 3 races you have to contend with the cops at the same time, survive for a period of time, thus completing the event. But if you get busted, you have to restart the whole event, which isn't a big deal since the events themselves don't take long to beat anyway. Then, of course, there's the Blacklist race, which introduces you to boss races, which are cars that can close the distance a lot easier than the usual races that you contend with. You can find the demo online if you're really that curious, and if they're even still around, you can also find those old blue PS2 demo discs that contain the demo for Most Wanted. I enjoyed it as a kid, and it made me excited as hell for the release, but playing it now grown up, holy shit, it is bad. As for the final product, I have pretty much the same opinion as I did when I was a kid, but this time I have a lot more to say about it, and can appreciate more of what it tried to accomplish. So the setting of Most Wanted is a complete departure from the Underground settings, driving at night with the neon bright lights, and what we get here instead is a daytime setting in Rockport, a very rundown and grimy city, with the same theme of street racing making a return. You, the player, are one of those racers making a name for themselves. Of course, it isn't all easy, because not too long after you accept the challenge of another racer, you're stopped by a police car, in a Corvette, and the police are one of the main cause of Most Wanted and a never-ending presence. Sergeant Cross is one of those officers we get to meet, and he makes it clear that street racing is going to be a thing of the past soon. Luck saves the day though, and you'll let go. The player ends up finding another racer, and this is where the story really starts. You get introduced to the game's main antagonist after beating one of his own. Here comes Razor, one of the series' most hated and iconic villains in the whole series. And then comes Mia, the game's girl basically, who looks out for you. So this whole prologue has you enjoying this beautiful car, and you dominate in the races. You get your first crack at a Blacklist race, a one-on-one race with a car on the line, And initially you seem to be fine until you get a call about an oil leak.
Hey, there's something wrong with your ride. You left a huge oil slick at the start line. You have to end the race fast.
And it leads to this. You lose the car, and you get mocked to no end until the cops finally show up, and as a result you get busted, and time moves forward. Mia picks you up and explains that Razor basically used the most legendary car in the whole franchise to get to the #1 spot on the Blacklist, which is a league of notorious racers with a lot of bounty and a lot of rep under their belt. And you, without your BMW, now have to start all over again, with a brand new car. Afterwards, you go to the safe house, and Mia gives the rundown on how to tackle the Blacklist, basically explaining how you progress through the game. So it goes like this. There are 15 Blacklist members. 15 times you have to obtain milestones that you get from the cop chasers, obtain a certain amount of bounty, and win a certain amount of races. Afterwards, the Blacklist racer will then challenge you, giving you a chance to take their spot. Rinse and repeat for the entire game until you finally reach Razor and get that BMW back. And that's really just the main story. You get screwed over, and now you have to climb your way back to get your car. And oh boy, is it a lot of fun to do anyway, for a number of reasons. The setting overall is something that is both different and refreshing at the same time. The run-down ghetto-esque nature of Rockport gives the setup of its racing scene more of a word-of-mouth, makeshift approach. So no sponsors, no visual rating bullshit, just get whatever parts make your car go fast and win. And if the cops are onto you, you better not get caught. Rockport itself is divided up into 3 zones, each having their own distinctive areas and scenery. You have Rosewood's country town vibe, surrounding mountains, and a big golf course to enjoy. Camden Beach with its industrial docks and coastal bays. And finally you have Rockport City itself, which looks cleaner and more maintained in comparison. The map itself is considerably large, maybe not quite as much as Underground 2, but just enough where it doesn't feel like a chore every time you have to go from one place to another. It's not exactly my favourite setting, but it fits the game so well here and really nails down the grittier vibe that this game has in contrast to the Underground games. Story-wise, it's my favourite in the series. The characters are pretty memorable. The payoff to beating the villain is really satisfying after costing you your car. The writing is very cringe, but in a way that makes me laugh, and this scene is always a classic.
I want every single unit after the guy.
Everyone?
Everyone!
The live action aspect is something I really enjoy too. It's a hell of a lot better than the comic implementations in Underground 2. In retrospect though, they do look pretty rough on the surface, and that's because of early CGI tech that was utilised for these cutscenes. It's something that is easier done nowadays thanks to improved technology, but with what they had to work with here, Black Box still did a terrific job here. When you beat the story, you have quick races that let you select a random car or a car of your own choosing. There's also the challenge mode, with almost 70 events that you can complete and unlock bonus cars. It's a nice chunk of side content that you can enjoy. It will still take you a bit of time though, since the later ones are really hard, especially the one where you have to be in a pursuit for 30 minutes and escape. So the story loop of the game is, as I said, you go through the Blacklist containing 15 races, each with their own race, bounty and milestone requirements. You go through the races, get into cop chases and obtain bounty, all for the sake of getting a crack at the Blacklist races one by one. Beating a Blacklist racer gives you 2 markers. You can get a unique performance part, a visual part, or a body part. The other 3 markers could be a get out of jail marker, a car release marker, a cash marker, or even better, a pink slip marker, giving you access to their ride. Black Box did it this way so that you wouldn't have an abundance of cars just because a Blacklist race is basically a pink slip race, although you won't always get lucky, and you may not get their ride. Some in particular though look absolutely amazing, like Sonny's Golf, Earl's Lancer, or JV's Viper. These were cars I'd always try to get, even if I never used them. But say if you don't get the car you want, then this is what I would do. I turn autosave off, and then I save before the Blacklist race. That way I can revert and try my luck again. The bosses themselves each have different races you need to beat them in. Depending on your car, or should I say, your skills, you'll generally be able to manage them pretty easily. Although they give you more of a challenge than the normal races due to their tendency to catch up quite a bit. But if you're using a Lotus Elise with Junkman parts, then you will never, ever lose to these guys. I promise you. But all in all, the Blacklist drivers are all pretty memorable here. They each have distinctive designs of their cars and have backgrounds that let you learn a little bit more about them. Some of them even send you a message throughout the game. Or you get word from Rog, another character who assists you throughout the game, that the Blacklist racer that you're challenging wants a race. Fun fact, Rog was originally supposed to be a Blacklist racer, making him number 16, but in the final release they changed him to just being another racer that helps you out and gives you tips. As for the races, you have Circuit, Sprint, Lap Knockout, and Drag making a return. However, Drift got taken out, which was disappointing, because it was one of my favourite modes in Underground 1 and 2. But some additions have joined the mix, like Speed Trap and Toll Booth. Speed Trap is basically Sprint, but with obtaining the highest speed determining who comes first. At each checkpoint, whoever gets the fastest speed will take the lead, and each checkpoint adds the total amount. I'm not the biggest fan of this mode because sometimes the traffic can be a nuisance and you can lose your speed at the most crucial moments. And the way some checkpoints are structured, oftentimes they'll still screw you over just because of the layout if you're unlucky. You might just lose anyway just because some cars go way faster than they're supposed to, even when you're ahead of the cars or even when you're going at your fastest. Word of advice though, try to get as much distance from your opponents as possible, because if the race is tied on points, the other racers will lose points if they haven't reached the finish line first. But remember, the same also goes for you, so be careful. Toll Booth is basically a time trial race. You have a certain amount of time to reach the checkpoints and it's the easiest mode in the game. I usually do these races to meet the criteria for each Blacklist racer. There's not really a lot to say about them other than it's just a time trial race, where it's just you against the clock. The other race types function the same pretty much. Drag, however, is a different story. I absolutely hate it in this game. There are way too many turns you have to make, and given the lane-by-lane pathfinding system that's been configured for the cars in this race type, it just doesn't work very well here. Oftentimes, I'd crash just because my car wouldn't switch lanes far enough and ends up hitting a car anyway. Traffic is generally always heavy and fucks you over 90% of the time. And to add insult to injury, you get paid fuck all for the effort of it all. Some of the Blacklist races will force you into one, but they're not as annoying, and plus, if you know how, you can cause them to crash, making the race for the most part a cakewalk. Otherwise, I generally ignore the drag races outside of the Blacklist drag races. They're not fun at all to do, period. And no, I do not care that they're short this time. In Underground 1 and 2, the lines were straight as they should be. In Most Wanted, they're more dynamic, and that's where they fucked up in my opinion. I'm just glad that you don't have to do them as much. As for the other race types, they're fine, with a lot of long or short courses that even sometimes cover all 3 districts. The laps will vary from 2 to 4, and some races will also have a minimum or maximum police presence. Minimum basically means no cops at all, and maximum means you'll most likely encounter a cop during a race. And that's another thing entirely, the cops themselves. The cops are the game's biggest and arguably funnest feature. Black Box created one of the best implementations of cop chases ever in an arcade racing game. The physics of crashing into them, bringing down structures to take them out, and the fantastic physics of the cop crashes makes about the other half of what makes this game so good. You will be racing and getting into cop chases, either outside of races or during races. You have a total of 5 heat levels, with some exceptions exceeding to 6 or 7. Each heat level has its own cop cars, use of tactics, cooldown timers, and backup timers. Depending on your progress, you'll want to have a higher heat level due to the fact that the requirements only get higher. You increase heat level by continuing chases, you decrease heat levels by either customizing the car differently or using a different car. The tactics usually consist of boxing you in, setting up roadblocks or spike strips, getting in front of you and stopping, or getting a helicopter to stick to you like glue. Heat level 4 and 5 are the hardest ones because they have spike strips and heavier SUV units that are like tanks, and if they're heading towards you, you better dodge it, otherwise you're more or less screwed. Also, never ever reset your car if you can help it, otherwise this happens.
I copy that. Suspect is in custody. Repeat, suspect in custody. SOU members en route requesting you hold the suspect.
When you get busted, you have to either pay a fine or a marker, and if you can't do either, your car gets impounded, and if you lose all of your cars, then it's game over. So it's in your best interest to pay attention and not get busted at all if possible. But as you keep playing, you eventually develop strategies or workarounds to make the pursuits manageable. Either way, it's really fun to do, especially when you ram through roadblocks and flip Corvettes over. Also, during Heat Level 5, you even get Sergeant Cross himself joining the pursuit. Getting rid of him can sometimes be difficult, but if you do, you get a lot of bounty from him. The pursuits are something you can't avoid since it's pretty much the other half of the game, and you need to do them anyway in order to get to the Blacklist races. So if you don't enjoy the chases, then your time with the game will end there. As for me, I can pop in Most Wanted and do a cop chase and still have an amazing time like I used to when I was a kid. None of the other Need for Speed games have implemented a pursuit system as good as Most Wanted, and it's a damn shame. Customization this time around is a bit more limited, but given the more run-down nature of Most Wanted, it makes sense. Racers aren't too concerned this time with the visuals of a car, so no neons, spinner rims, or trunks with speakers and surround sounds. It's all about the performance here. You do still get a good variety of vinyls and body parts, decals, and even speedometer setups though. Paints, however, are hit and miss. There aren't enough bright colours, most of them look washed out. The colours are either too dark or just don't look very good, with some exceptions. I'm just thankful that the game gets rid of the whole visual rating crap that they forced you to do in Underground 2. In Most Wanted, you have way more freedom to make your car look the way you want it to. Your opponents don't do much either with their visuals, and that's just the thing. Most Wanted isn't about visuals, it's performance. Most of your money will be spent on those parts. You have the same parts again from the previous Underground games, but you also have Junkman parts that you can obtain from Blacklist races if you select the marker. Once you use that marker though, you have to get another one, and make sure you use it on the car you want. I ended up investing those parts on the Lotus Elise, and holy shit, the thing is a rocket. The Blacklist races I was left with stopped being a problem afterwards and just became pathetically easy. Every car in the game is usable, with some pros and cons. This time though, you have more variety, with some tuners, exotics, and some muscle cars. No longer is it JDM centric like Underground 1 and 2. Now you have a variety of options. No Nissans though, due to licensing issues, which is disappointing, but the options are fantastic nonetheless, going from a Golf all the way up to a Lamborghini Murcielago or a Porsche Carrera. The car tuning makes a return too, but in a more streamlined manner. Again, it's not necessary to use, but for people looking to get more out of their car, it certainly helps. The car handling has been overhauled big time, and all for the better. Black Box have made the perfect model in my opinion for the series. The sense of speed is amazing without being ludicrous like Burnout 3. The physics are solid in both traffic and opponents. Cop car crashing is fun as hell to do, and the sense of driving is fast but not too fast here like I just said. Out of all of the games, Most Wanted is my favourite in this regard. There is a nice balance of embracing its arcade roots while still keeping it grounded in reality. Cars still react to terrain, you lose speed big time when hitting traffic or objects, and the game's speed isn't to the point where you're using jet fighters. I would say that towards the end, it'll sometimes feel like an F1 car if you're using the later exotics. A new addition to the game's handling is the Speed Breaker system. It's a slow motion mode that gives you breathing room to get out of tight corners or dangerous situations regarding Rhino SUVs or spike strips. It's really useful at times, but you also lose a good amount of speed. Oh, and using it in drag races is nearly suicide unless you don't turn too much. It naturally replenishes over time like your nitrous does, so be careful not to overuse it too much. The game is 18 years old and still handles like a dream when it comes to the cars. It's tight in its execution and every car feels like a joy to drive, especially when you get the BMW back. I'd argue that it handles even better than the recent Need for Speed games, which honestly don't handle that well at all. Just look at Need for Speed 2015 or Unbound. The only other game that replicated Need for Speed Most Wanted's driving system is Need for Speed Carbon, that came out a year after Most Wanted. Whether we get a worthy successor to this model is uncertain. Criterion certainly needs to get rid of the one Ghost Games did with their own. Maybe just look at Most Wanted and update it a bit. There you go. A perfect driving model on your platter. The soundtrack is once again another banger in the golden age of the Need for Speed games, with again a mix of electronic, hip-hop, rock, and metal music to enjoy. So many iconic and memorable tracks can be found here. What you get is something that is reflective of its time and yet timeless here. The soundtrack is so good that it even gets compared to later Need for Speed titles, often in favour of Most Wanted soundtrack, in order to belittle the soundtracks of Need for Speed Heat or Need for Speed Unbound, which have been critiqued for their soundtrack choices. But as I've said before in the past, licensed soundtracks are very hard to do, because not everyone is going to enjoy the music that's been selected. You, as the developer, can only pick the music that you feel suits your game the best. Most Wanted setting is both grimy, rundown, and industrial, The soundtrack that was selected for that game reflects that setting well, whereas Unbound comes with a hip-hop centric graffiti background, and so the soundtrack is predominantly hip-hop because of that. But in the case of Most Wanted, Black Box have come up with an amazing collection, with tracks that are still bangers to this day. The graphics still hold up okay for a 2005 game. The car models are pretty sharp, environments have benefited from the HD transition. The same cannot be said though for the PS2 port, which looks terrible by comparison. And don't get me started on the portable spin-offs. The highlights are of course the cars themselves, which has always been the case considering that in a racing game, the cars themselves always have to stand out. Traffic is generic and piss poor in terms of design. Cop cars are given better treatment, but even then they're a little bit rougher around the edges. Rockport looks great with its industrial focus setting, and for a launch title it still looks pretty good at times, especially on the Xbox 360 or the PC. In conclusion, Need for Speed Most Wanted is still in my opinion the best game in the series. It does so much right and is consistently a fun and enjoyable experience across the board. Has a great story and setting, the best handling in the whole series, a nice selection of cars, fun and entertaining police pursuits, and a great soundtrack. Most Wanted went above and beyond with what Underground 1 and 2 had already achieved. It even lets you do all of the events in the safe house menu, so no more busy work traveling, and no more visual ratings. It does, however, make a few steps back, like with the drag races, and admittedly the repetitive approach to progressing through the blacklist. Given the overall history, you could argue that this was the peak of the series, and honestly, you wouldn't be wrong. It's not often that a game of any genre is looked back after so many years and is still highly regarded. I've played heaps of games when I was younger, games that were critically acclaimed at the time, but when I revisited them for the first time in years, they weren't as good as I remembered. Most Wanted, however, is an exception. It was amazing back then and it's still amazing now. Need for Speed Most Wanted is a prime example of how to perfectly execute a fun and balanced racing game that has a variety of content in spades, while still providing a familiar and refreshing setting that Need for Speed fans are familiar with. Something that the series had needed. Whether there'll ever be a Need for Speed game just as good if not better than Most Wanted in the future is really hard to say, but with the way it's going right now, I don't think so. Some serious work is needed as well as overhauling the approach to how to make a Need for Speed game. I have seen fan-made projects do a much better job so far. Just go and look at the Underground 2 remake videos and you'll see what I mean. Regardless, Need for Speed Most Wanted is still an amazing racing game, and for the foreseeable future, it is the GOAT of the series. Thank you for watching.
Stopping. I'm going to try to ease him over. Deploying 1059.